Welcome back. If you just joined us once again, this is KTN Prime, and right now we're shifting gears to the discussion tonight. An interesting one, by the way, and we are looking at the IMF pressure versus Kenya's budget reality, and we are looking at the tough choices ahead for the Kenyan government, which is finding it increasingly difficult to finance, basically from the International Monetary Fund following the global lenders tightening of its conditions for assistance, especially on governance and fiscal responsibility. Well, in recent months, the Ruto administration has been holding talks with the IMF to explore renewal of financing facilities that came to an end last year. But there has been little progress, more so because of the government's failure to fulfill its end of the agreement. And a critical concern is Kenya's debt is accumulating at an insatiable pace and is almost crossing the threshold to default. Last week, two reports by the IMF cast doubt also on Kenya's debt record, saying it was difficult to establish how much the country owes because of its accounting procedures. Indeed, interesting developments, and I have a very able panel tonight to help us understand exactly what this development means. And we have Jotham Wadongo, who is a development finance specialist at the Expertise Global. Thank you for making time.
Thank you, Leah.
And we have also Ruth Kinyanjui, an economist and governance expert. Thank you for making time, Ruth.
Thank you, Leah.
And we also have Christopher Kirade, who is a tax partner at the EY. So lovely to have you as well.
Thank you very much, Leah.
It's interesting to see what is happening in the country as far as what is coming as a warning from the IMF. But before we delve deep into this very, very important discussion, I just want us to take a look at one of the reports that was prepared by one of our reporters not too long ago, just to also give us at least an understanding of some of the key issues we'll be looking at tonight. So let's just have that story run at this moment.
The Kenyan delegation, led by Treasury Cabinet Secretary John Mbadi, Principal Secretary Chris Kiptoo, and Central Bank CBK Governor Kamau Thuge, had arrived in the U.S. capital, hopeful for a positive outcome, with Kenya scrambling for a bailout after months of rocky talks, even as fiscal crisis worsens amid the widening economic shocks from the Iran war. The engagement was to focus on Kenya's macroeconomic performance, reform priorities, and the evolving global economic outlook. However, the team was to met with a surprise after Fund's technical arm pinpointed deep flaws in how Nairobi reports its true liabilities, warning that a narrow legal definition of debt could mask a significant portion of country's 12.8 trillion budget.
It is appalling that the entire National Treasury left Kenya, a delegation of many aircrafts, went to Washington ostensibly to seek what securitization means.
The report, an April 2026 high-level summary and detailed technical assistance assessment, concluded that while Kenya's published debt statistics are broadly accurate, the Kenya Kwanza government is largely not observing international standards on transparency.
Kenyans who look at things through the lenses of reality have continuously been saying and have been continuously challenging the government that securitization is illegal, and the process of securitization must be part of the national debt.
The IMF demands that more comprehensive public debt statistics reports be produced to provide full transparency and address any user concerns of there being hidden debts. It cites the $3.5 billion railway debt deal with China as an example, saying converting it into a special loan arrangement helps hide the true size of the country's debt. The IMF has raised fresh concerns at a difficult time for President William Ruto. Just weeks ago, Kenya had taken a tough stance after talks collapsed in March, with the government rejecting strict IMF demands on austerity and debt transparency ahead of the next general election. The IMF assessments highlights multiple discrepancies. Debt reported by the National Treasury, CBK, and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics are often inconsistent. Martin Opio, KTN.
And well, in light of that report by Martin Opio, shedding light on some of the key issues we'll be discussing tonight, I want us to look at the development from the IMF. The IMF raising concerns over what it says is what looks like hidden debt in Kenya. And to this extent, the IMF has warned that it may hold back funding due to lack of transparency. But let's just shed more light on this. I'll begin with you, Christopher. When the IMF is saying that there's a likelihood of hidden debt in Kenya, what does this mean?
Interesting that the discussion is around accounting for, for debt. And I think, when you look at it, when you securitize, debt, it's simply collateralizing debt. And therefore that amount that you got is actually debt. So if Kenya is not accounting amounts securitized as debt, then Kenya is at fault. It's clear that that is debt, that is money borrowed against future cash flows expected. That is not different from any loan borrowed, because any loan borrowed is hedged against future cash flows. So in my view, it is debt, and I think IMF is right to call that out. Thank you.
Ruth, your thoughts on this? What do you feel about the IMF and its statement of saying that there's what seems to be hidden debt in Kenya? Just to make sense, especially for Kenyans who are watching tonight, and we are all asking, what is this hidden debt in detail?
I think one of the things that has been major issue or push even from IMF, of course, was fiscal consolidation, with just ensuring that Kenya can be able to align properly with the debt deficit or, budget deficits. But that notwithstanding, I think we've had a problem with the debt issues, and especially the fact that we haven't seen, like previously we have seen some debts that have been issued that didn't really go to public good or helping with the public good or assisting with the normal developmental issue of the government or of the public. So with that in mind, there has been a lot of things we can call bad debts, but more so because we've seen that previously or even currently, a lot of the amount of income collected from the Kenyan economy goes to payment of debt, which is close almost to 60–70%, which with that in mind, you can imagine then it's going to push other economical areas to a strain, first starting with developmental agenda. And considering during this, the 3 years, or the four, we call this the 4 years of this government, that the first 3 years, they were not able to do much because there was a lot of consumption. So with that in mind, it's like debt and consumption was finishing everything for development. Secondly, the other thing that I've seen, maybe the main push of IMF is the fact that also the straining of economy first, because from a fiscal perspective, still there's nothing much there's nothing much or we can be able to add to Kenyans. Of course, Kenyans are already too much alert for tax addition, but IMF is trying to push the whole issue about widening of tax base. How long can that take for the government to be able to take more so that it can have enough to pay to make debt repayment, but at the same time they ensure that the economy is also not constrained, there is running of the economy. So with all that in mind, then I think there's and also the fact that there has been a lot of accountability issues, so can the government be seen, or can it be accountable enough when it comes to debt and debt audits? And I know there is a committee that had been formed like 2 years ago. How far can we be able to tell with that? And maybe IMF is feeling like even with that committee, maybe a lot has not come through. And because we are heading to the budget process right now in the month of April, May, and I know the bills will be proceeding to Parliament, maybe IMF is trying to push for that and ensure that measures can be taken even before the bill goes to Parliament and before the reaction of the public and even before going to the assent.
All right. And Jotham, the IMF urging better reporting of debts beyond the current narrow definition. The IMF calls it a narrow definition. What do you make of this comment? Is it to say that the transparency from our government is really wanting?
Yeah, I think to just connect on what has been spoken earlier by my fellow panelists, I think we need to have a full appreciation of what the obligations of the country stand at. And some of the debt the securitized debts that has been already spoken to earlier from a government perspective, because you've already secured those with assets, then in terms of managing obligations, then it shouldn't really be a challenge. But as already mentioned earlier, a debt is a debt. Whether you've attached an asset to it, it still eats away the funds available for you to direct it towards expenditure. And I mean, when you're looking at expenditure, that's how government services are actually going to be delivered. So by expanding that definition to cover all obligations, it helps in various ways. One, even in terms of prioritizing where the government needs to spend money, but also helping to manage our debt sustainability and being able to borrow what we can actually pay. So I think it's coming from that place that having a full view of what you owe can also allow you to even plan better for when certain instruments can be procured to support the budget.
All right. And if we just look at what the IMF has said here, warning that if the government does not address this particular issue of what it calls as a current narrow definition of reporting of debts, that it may hold back funding due to this lack of transparency. By chance, if the IMF was to hold back funding, what will that mean for a country like Kenya, Christopher?
Interesting. So you will know that one of the conditions, for IMF lending is, the government must ensure fiscal consolidation, reducing the fiscal deficit. And probably that's why, tinkering with the definition of debt allows, a wider, fiscal deficit on the side of government. But let's look at it, your question. What would happen if IMF held back the money? So we must then do a situation analysis. Where are we? When you look at the deficit, by the supplementary, appropriation bill, the deficit is 1.3 trillion. So, in as much as, yes, we are projecting to collect, more taxes by, enhancing and widening tax base and everything, already you can see the exposure that Kenya has. So additional exposure or withholding of debt by an IMF then exacerbates this position. It makes it much worse for Kenya. So Kenya will then has to resort to domestic borrowing. That of itself crowds out private players in Kenya, and then there will be not available funds for private investment and spurring economic growth.
Interesting. And, there's been a great concern about how many SMEs have been falling in the country, of course, citing issues of not being able to, continue running their companies. The expenses are high, the taxation is high, and the money that they're able to make, really, it's not proving enough for them to continue running their companies. I mean, when you look at these revelations, and the question of transparency, I want us to focus on that a little bit, Ruth, because Kenyans have questioned, why can't we at least know how much debt do we have exactly? I mean, the IMF has to come in and ask the question of, what looks like potential hidden liabilities. What does that tell of the kind of government we have right now and how they are running the issue of debt in the country? Ruth?
Thank you so much. I look at that in many ways, and I can just go back to the committee that I had mentioned on debt, audit of debt, that had been formed I think a year or two back. And I know maybe the government wanted itself first to know what it's having, but I doubt this is information that it would be willing to dispense to the public. And on issue of even IMF pushing, I don't think IMF can really stop Kenya from borrowing. Maybe it can push for austerity in terms of being a bit strict to its borrowing or putting them in check, but it won't really stop Kenya maybe from borrowing. Why do I say that? Because, like, for example, this week only, the president and the delegation is in Italy. There's a lot of conversation going on there. And as long as the government can see players or partners that it can partner with, and opportunities, especially with many developmental agendas going on, especially in this year, 2026, it might be really hard to limit debt. However, that not outstanding. There's a lot of critical issues that can, if properly managed, surrounding our debt story, and especially because we are seeing maybe the last like 4 or 5 years, like we have overborrowed. If measures can be put in place, I think I normally look at this country like it has enough resources, and especially there are some measures I feel the government has never put in place, and it's a consideration or something to rethink that can really be able to bring some of these issues on the table. And one of it is like expenditure rationalization. You see, we've never seen one of it that it has been really strict enough to ensure that the government also is limiting its expenditure enough. When things are bad, people will say, oh, the government will be told, we are restricting on the travel and all that. But if we look at anything, it's go by whatever is happening this week, then we can tell that right now there's no restriction to that. So still government is operating on full blown. So, and IMF is, I think, it's just coming to remind the government, a few things needs to be worked on, and that is what has not been there when it comes to social integration, and just ensure that Mwananchi is informed of what they need to know. I think, Leah, this country has done very poorly when it comes to communication and even on the achievement, leave alone on the things that they do not know. Even the achievement of what the government has done is something that I find that the public does not get. And then that is left as a gap in terms of maybe people who are in social media or, bloggers or people we call like that, because no one actually knows. And that is a big problem. And maybe that's why we are seeing stakeholders push to ensure that the government is lying. But what happens during this season between now, April, and all the time to June when the budget is being read, what the antennae of the public is up there. And right now, with the availability of information, even through, and the Kenyans are very inquisitive, then they will go and find up, and you'll find some of the information leaking, and that is where you find the push. The government now fights with these people when people are looking for accountability. And I can tell you, Leah, the people of this country are not looking for much, just accountability, and knowing that the money that is being gotten is going to the right places or for the right job.
And interestingly, as you talk about accountability, not too long ago, I think it should be around March, where the government rejected strict IMF demands on austerity and this debt transparency. And again, as you say, Kenyans, of course, just want information. Tell us exactly what's happening with our debt issue. When you look at this issue of austerity measures, this coming as demands from the IMF, what do these austerity measures entail, Jotham?
Thank you. I think for each IMF program, it comes with the fiscal consolidation, where you're looking basically at reducing expenditure. And I think the case that resonates with most Kenyans right now is when we saw our fuel prices going up the other day, and the government had to step in and give a subsidy, and also we saw on the other side where the VAT was actually cut. So some of the funds that are actually used to prevent the shocks from fuel rises, which are very important for Mwananchi, from an IMF perspective, then the question is, are these actually sustainable? So we could look at subsidies as one of the areas where the government can save in terms of the expenditure. And then there's also been push around how public organizations are managing resources. And when I talk about public organizations, I'm talking at it in general. So even when you look at like parastatals, which have predominantly have to be bailed out, then there is also an opportunity for the government actually to reduce expenditure there. So it can take various forms, but the whole idea is, can the government actually reduce the expenditure level, so that on one side we're pushing to expand our tax base and be able to generate more, but even with the little that we have, how well are we spending that money. So the measures actually go towards just making sure that we are very efficient in our spending our budget, but also there's a bit of credibility in how our funds are being used.
What do you make of the government's transparency in how it has been spending? There's been such, a lot of questions on how the government is kicking off projects, but then when you look at what they're yielding for the country, it's not really that evident. But let me just hear from you, Jotham. When you look at how the government has been spending, what do you feel about, the track record of government expenditure?
Yeah, thank you for that, Leah. I think there's to a large extent, some misaligned priorities. So there are some sectors where we would expect to see a lot more being spent, especially sectors that have a direct impact on mwananchi. So we are looking at health, we are looking at sectors that, fund programs, for example, for children and immunization. And for that one specifically, it's quite critical because when you look at even some of the donors who've been giving money towards such programs, some of them are already in an accelerated phase of actually transitioning that responsibility back to government. So one would expect that, for example, when you have big players who are giving money towards programs like nutrition, then we can see an increased allocation towards such sectors. But when you do an analysis of allocation to these sectors, you can actually see that in real terms, some of those sectors, the expenditure has actually been going down. And these are sectors that are quite critical to mwananchi. And I think also when you look at in terms of accountability, every time the Auditor General reports are published, we can see that there are some portions of monies that cannot be explained. So I would say by and large, in terms of transparency, there's still scope for improvement. One of the things I must acknowledge is that I think there's a lot more information being shared specifically on debt. Now the question is whether then the burden of actually going in to analyze such data then still remains with mwananchi. So there's still a lot that the government can do to synthesize this information into a level that any person can be able to interact with that information. It might be easy for us. I mean, Chris there is a tax specialist, so crunching those numbers might be easy. But I'm just imagining if I'm a trader on the street and you're telling me about things like absorption rate and the efficiency of the budget, it's still, yes, you've shared information, but it doesn't really help me to make a decision. So there's still a bit of scope of improvement to make this more palatable for the general public.
I know we're meant to be taking a short break, but I'll come to you, Christopher, quickly. Listening to what Jotham is talking about brings me to the question of IMF's assessment highlighting multiple discrepancies. And this talking about that numbers reported by the National Treasury, CBK, and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which are said to be often inconsistent. What do you make of this?
So the one thing that is rarely appreciated is that, IMF is a lender, and any lender is expected to do some due diligence before they lend. They must establish that you have capacity to pay and you have the liquidity. So this is not unusual for IMF to do this. What is unusual is that it is coming at this time because probably it should have been picked earlier, but nonetheless, it is what it is, and we are here. So, in the course of then checking, establishing, the ability to pay and the liquidity, this is where this is being unearthed. But remember, this has been a question in Kenyans' minds for a very long time. How much do we owe? Who do we owe? I think you remember, that has been a discussion for so long. And now, it's unfortunate that even the government is not being able to tell transparently as it should, because, this is, civic duty. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
it's all right. But
yes.
When you talk about the discrepancies that the IMF is talking about quickly, what do you think this does to the user confidence?
it completely erodes confidence and, first of all, trust. Because then it's only that had IMF not come in, we would have continued with this level of, opaqueness in our debt. And remember, a normal mwananchi is asking, we have piled on this debt, but yet when I walk on the streets, show me the projects. Please show me the projects, because that's how, we all perceive. So we picked 100 billion. Where is it in terms of infrastructure or whatever? So there has been a level of fiscal indiscipline that has led us to here, and the only way was to cover by being opaque. It would seem.
Now, if we have a government that is not willing to be transparent, and where is the country headed, Ruth?
I think one of the biggest problems that I have seen, especially when it comes to budgeting, remember the whole budgeting process is where even corruption is budgeted. And one of the biggest problems with the government, and maybe the reason why IMF is pushing for, is structural reforms, the whole issue about transparency and governance. And it goes down to what Jotham had said earlier, even the issues of the Auditor General's, reports that are done, how well are they worked on to ensure that we can be able to have transparent conversation, and that the public is informed. Everything about the Auditor General is put in the public, but the structural reform is something that the government is very careful in terms of taking care and ensuring that this information is not spilling to the public as it should. And maybe the way they deal with that, especially the whole issue of transparency, accountability, is what is the biggest problem. And right now, I think IMF is coming to tell them, you should be doing the things that you are supposed to be doing. And it comes down to ensuring that there is enough income for the country to ensure that as much as there is a lot of debt that you're paying, that even if we are going to be lending you more, that we can be able to trust you even with the cash flow that you're talking, future cash flow that you're talking about in the future, which sometimes is not promised, because if the private sector is going to be constrained, you can be sure that income will be short-lived, or will not get to the levels that maybe the government is promising, and all that. And also the fact that maybe IMF, especially previously, we have seen last year and the last 2 years, they came and put their bare minimums, but still the government was able to go to other countries and borrow. There's China, and we saw that, I think, the conference that was there 2 years ago.
It feels very interesting, because if then the IMF is talking about be transparent,
yes,
tell us how you're spending the money and how you're using the cash flow, so that you're able also to finance the debt. And of course, like you mentioned, again, Kenya is out there looking at China. So if the IMF does not give Kenya money, Kenya goes to other lenders. But well, let's just take a quick break. We'll be back shortly to look at, those details, interesting details unraveling at this moment. Stay tuned.